Good evening and welcome to The Proof is Out There. The media has been buzzing for the past few years over the government's release of videos showing unidentified craft filmed in the skies by our military. But many believe that UFOs have been observing on military bases for decades, and that this next photo proves it. It's October 16th, 1957. Ella Louise Fortune, a nurse at the Mescalero Indian Reservation in New Mexico, is driving north on Highway 54 when she sees something hovering in the sky over Holloman Air Force Base in Alamogordo. She happens to have her camera with her, so she pulls the car over and photographs this. A glowing, white, elongated, oval-shaped object is floating above the desert landscape. You can see why this photo caused such a stir. Just look at how bright it is, even in broad daylight. Check out the sharpness of the edges, here, there. And then you have this soft wisp. Is that exhaust? How would you fake that if you wanted to?
This photo is a classic in the UFO community that most people consider a genuine photograph that was not hoaxed.
Not only has the photo earned a place in UFO history, it ties into one of the most astonishing and durable stories of the UFO canon. Allegations that Holloman Air Base was the site of an interstellar summit where aliens forged an alliance with the U.S. government.
There's a story that circulates within UFO circles that President Dwight D. Eisenhower secretly met with aliens, and this alien gets shuffled into a back room and the president is flown in to specifically meet with this creature. So we have a lot of strange stories out there of secret meetings between presidents and aliens from other planets.
Now, according to some, during these secret meetings, President Eisenhower brokered a deal to allow the aliens to abduct humans in exchange for extraterrestrial black technology that would lead to developments like the B-2 stealth bomber. Is the photo we have here evidence of that advanced alien tech? We asked our experts to decide. We begin with military aviation expert Tim McMillan. Is it possible that white color and shape match something you'd expect to see near an Air Force base, namely a parachute?
Nothing about it is consistent with a parachute. In particular, you don't see a payload. The shape of it is inconsistent with what you would expect for a parachute. It is being weighted down by a payload.
Some have speculated it could be a balloon or blimp, but McMillan doesn't see it.
It doesn't resemble any obvious shape of a balloon. Also, it definitely appears to be extremely bright, and so it would have to have some type of light source, which wouldn't make sense for a balloon.
Next, we turn to Rich Hoffman from the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. This thing is white and in the sky. Could it just be a cloud?
It takes very strong winds to create that kind of like sharpness to the edges and creating the saucer-like look to it, because it doesn't even match what you would expect with the upper band cirrus clouds. So I don't see this as a cloud whatsoever.
Instead, Hoffman believes with some calculations, he can narrow down the possibilities.
It was roughly around 10,000 feet, and roughly they assumed it was 15 miles away. You do trigonometry. You're able to determine that it's roughly just over a mile long.
If Hoffman's numbers are correct, he says we can eliminate several other possibilities.
I would never go to the point of saying that this is a plane. The size makes no sense. It's a mile wide, and it's not a UFO. No objects, especially one a mile long, would not have gone undetected by the people that are positioned there monitoring that part of the sky.
So what could it be? Hoffman says location is the key.
There's one important thing that you need to know. Holloman Air Force Base was to the position of the witness's left. The vast majority of this area you're looking at is White Sands Missile Range. The fact that this is conveniently positioned right at 10,000 feet would probably make it very likely that it's a missile test of some sort.
McMillan agrees and believes the photo reveals an important clue.
There appears to be a contrail behind the object, which suggests that the object is moving and leaving a vapor trail that would be consistent with solid fuel burning.
A large vapor trail could also explain why this object looks a mile long, when in fact, it's much shorter.
The U.S. at the time was engaged in significant rocket testing, and especially we're in the height of the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union.
There were a whole variety of missiles that were being tested. It could have been fired from an aircraft or something that would have created a kind of plume of smoke like this.
But if this mile-long object is really just a trail of missile exhaust, we continue to ask ourselves, why do the edges look so distinct? Not to mention, a speeding missile doesn't match the eyewitness story. This thing had to hang in the air long enough for Ella to see it, park her car, get out, and take a photo. We can't help but feel we're still missing a piece of this puzzle. Our verdict? Still an unidentified object. Our experts bring up great points, but even if the contrail points to a chemical fuel burn and the missile range was a short 30 miles away, the image itself just doesn't give us enough info to definitively call it a missile or anything else. That keeps it a UFO in our book, for now. We're going to stay in the Southwest for this next story and fast forward from the 50s to the present day. We often look up at clouds and try to interpret the strange shapes. We might see horses, sharks, maybe even strange faces. But our next sighting involves a cloud shape so bizarre, the video footage set social media ablaze. Take a look. July 15th, 2022. It's a clear summer afternoon as Nisha Higgins is traveling down the highway in Tempe, Arizona. But as she drives past the airport, she catches something floating in the distance from the corner of her eye. So she pulls out her phone and captures this.
Y'all see that? What is that?
Let's zoom in. A mysterious-looking dark, oblong object appears to be stationary in front of the clouds. Honestly, it looks a little like that 1957 Holloman Air Force Base UFO. Author Jason Martell agrees that something here doesn't seem right.
We can see other clouds in the vicinity that are much more fluffy and nature of a concern to wonder what exactly it could be. But it just in general looks very UFO-like.
A UFO in the shape of a cloud? It may be a possibility.
If we think about ufology in general, there's many aspects where UFOs have used clouds or meteorological events to obfuscate what's really happening.
Social media sites are littered with UFO cloud sightings. In California, Mount Shasta is frequently blanketed by strange oblong clouds, which has prompted some speculation that these clouds act as a UFO cloaking device, hiding alien visitation in plain sight. But others argue these strange shapes are proof of government weather manipulation.
The phenomenon of cloud seeding is basically using certain chemicals that increase condensation inside the cloud, that way also increasing precipitation. This combination of chemicals has been known to cause rain clouds to form. We know that no less than 8 states across the U.S., Arizona being one of them, actually use cloud seeding to mitigate drought.
Hidden aliens, government weather manipulation, or something else, UFO clouds are having a moment. For millennia, oracles looked to the heavens and judged the significance of strange shapes in the sky. But in this modern space age, some are asking, could many of these strange shapes have been UFOs all along? Let's see if our experts can figure out if this cloud could be more than a cloud. First, could there be a spacecraft hiding in that cloud? We asked video analyst Mark D'Antonio.
The ATC, or Air Traffic Control, has pretty sophisticated radars. And right now, there's virtually no objects that can go undetected by airport radars.
A check of FAA records shows no near misses in the area that day, nor were there any nearby rocket launches. And while some argue UFOs might well have radar cloaking technology, D'Antonio points out the FAA isn't the only one monitoring the skies above Tempe.
If this was an actual craft, you can bet the folks from Williams Gateway or Luke Air Force Base, where there's lots of military presence, would have scrambled to go check it out.
So if it's not a secret alien ship, is it a government weather manipulation program?
Is this a cloud seeding project? The problem with that, for me, is that this is an extremely small localized cloud. But a cloud seeding operation is a vast operation. You're not going to cloud seed right in this one little spot. I don't see any way in which this could be weather manipulation, actually.
Okay, so if it's not artificial weather, could it be natural? According to meteorologist Juan Hernandez, the clue in the video is the surrounding Arizona terrain.
If we take a closer look down towards the ground, we notice that There is some terrain. So this is the Tempe area, which is surrounded by mountains on the north side and the eastern side.
These mountains, or specifically the cold gusts of wind that run up into them, collide with the moist atmosphere, creating lenticular clouds that could look a little or a lot like hovering flying saucers.
The wind cannot flow through the mountain. It must either flow around the mountain or on top of the mountain.
That upcurrent creates a standing wave of cold air, which then collides with moisture and forms this unique saucer-shaped cloud. But why does it appear to stay stationary, like an ominous hovering spacecraft?
Although the wind is quickly moving, lenticular clouds oftentimes look stationary because that's the right condition for the atmosphere to condensate.
After all, the perfect lenticular cloud conditions are created by unmoving terrain. So these clouds tend to form and dissipate in those perfect stationary spots.
And they oftentimes look fairly ominous. So I can see why someone would mistake this for a UFO.
Our verdict? Lenticular cloud. We agree with Juan Hernandez that this is an extraordinary-looking natural phenomenon. But if you happen to have your camera and get footage of a massive UFO drifting over your town, be sure to send it our way. We've all seen psychic mediums on talk shows claiming to communicate with the dead. But what if instead of on TV, it was happening live right before your very eyes? And what if the medium was an infant? Strap on your Pampers and check this out. It's December 2021 in the suburbs of Akron, Ohio. 22-month-old Evelyn Witt, known as Evie, is in her high chair when her mom, Tana, hears something odd and starts filming.
Who are you talking to?
The video shows that no one else is in the room with little Evie, but she seems to be having a chat with an invisible uncle.
Who are you talking to?
Tana wonders if the toddler is saying the word uncle.
Who are you talking to? Evelyn, who are you talking to?
That would make sense, since Tana's brother, Evie's uncle Tim, lived at home with Evie's grandmother, Deborah Henley. She watches the little girl during the day.
When I would go to the park, he'd come with me, so he'd help me. He would take her on the swings and down the slide, and, you know, he was just a big part of her life. What do you think?
Tragically, 1 month before Tana filmed her mysterious video, Uncle Tim died of an accidental drug overdose. So that begs the question, are we watching little Evie talking to Uncle Tim's ghost?
She talked a lot about Tim, and she would say things that I don't think that she knew as a young child.
Who else was happy?
Tim.
Tim's happy?
Yeah. She was talking to him. I'm almost sure of it.
Author Alexis Brooks suggests that young children potentially have a sixth sense and are actually able to see things that others aren't.
There's some theorists that say that babies can actually see beyond the visible spectrum of light. And it is said that the spirit world essentially lives outside of that visible spectrum.
In July 2021, another child went viral after he began talking to an invisible presence while his family was driving through California's Sierra National Forest. This apparent ghost sighting took place in an area where a woman named Sandra Johnson Hughes went missing a year earlier. And she looks just like how the boy described. There is another potential source of supernatural connection between children and the spirit world, the pineal gland, a little understood gland in the center of the brain that produces melatonin. It's been connected to the mystical third eye chakra of Eastern religions. Some claim children's pineal glands have not yet atrophied, which give them visibility into a broader spectrum of reality. But what is our experts' sense? First, we ask forensic video analyst Michael Primo to authenticate the footage.
The recording's structure was analyzed, and there is specific metadata in the file, which would have been produced from the original version. So there is no evidence to suggest that any kind of fabrication occurred with this interaction.
Who are you talking to?
So the video is authentic. But is Evie's apparent encounter with Uncle Tim? Can children really see things adults can't? Can children see outside the visible spectrum of light, as some have claimed? One 2018 study published by the University of Georgia showed young people can detect ultraviolet light down to a wavelength of 315 nanometers, much lower than the average middle-aged adult. Still, Dr. Ed Hope doubts this study explains what we're seeing here.
In general, children's vision is actually worse than our vision. In fact, when you're born, you only see black and white and have very limited vision, and this increases rapidly in the first 6 months. So there will still be some development with the eyes and vision at this age.
Theoretical physicist Dr. Michio Kaku adds that Evie is also still developing her social skills and her understanding of object permanence. So, could she be chatting with an imaginary friend?
Sometimes their imaginary friends are confused with real ones. It won't be till around age 3 that a sense of what is real and not real becomes solidified in their mind, and realize that she's only 22 months old.
Who are you talking to?
Then what do our experts think is the cause of Evie's inexplicable interactions with Uncle Tim?
I think the most likely situation here is that Evelyn is mimicking behaviors of the family members around her. Going through a bereavement, kids are like sponges, and this is a way of Evelyn dealing with that situation.
Still, Evie continuously turns back and addresses the same exact spot in the room. Even Dr. Kaku cautions against jumping to conclusions.
Obviously, she has an emotional connection, but the key question is, to what? The danger is that we impose our understanding of life and death to children. Their understanding of life and death could be quite different from those of an adult. Maybe children can see another aspect of reality that we cannot see.
So this is a tough one, because we witnessed in real time Evelyn having conversations with an invisible or imaginary entity. For now, we're saying these interactions are unexplained. It's certainly possible Evie was just imagining her uncle was there, but we can't say that for sure, and the family is convinced that something more was going on. In the meantime, they urge anyone affected by substance abuse in Ohio to contact Hope United. When you're all alone in nature, the most innocuous animal noises can be unsettling. Even the sound of a tiny chipmunk scurrying through the leaves can feel like a potential threat. So imagine being alone and hearing the shrieks of what could potentially be a Sasquatch. Don't watch this next story alone. December 2017, Whitsett, British Columbia, Canada. It's a snowy, overcast day in this remote village. Upon hearing something eerie in the woods behind his home, a man pulls out his camera and records this. Take another listen. It's a guttural howl emanating from the forest. The witness pans the camera around, trying to find where exactly it's coming from. Field researcher Cliff Barrickman draws a comparison with these noises and the famous Sierra sounds recorded in Northern California in the 70s.
The Sierra sounds are singularly important in the study of Sasquatches. The sounds represent a wide variety of very strange vocalizations that were emitted from unseen entities in the woods. It sounds like people actually speaking an unknown language.
Important to note, whatever made the Sierra sounds has never been identified. As with the recent sounds in British Columbia, Barrickman thinks they could be the sounds of Sasquatch communicating.
We believe that Sasquatches are probably moving about in kind of loose groups.
Even if they move in small groups like gorillas do, Barrickman says they often spread out.
So, in the kind of habitat they like to live in, they wouldn't be able to see the other individuals in their family groups. They would have to call for them, whether it's mating or socialization or feeding or whatever.
However, some wonder if these sounds could be connected to another recent horror story from the region. Between 2007 and 2019 in the nearby Salish Sea, 20 disembodied human feet encased in shoes and sneakers washed up onto the shore. Some suggest that this could be evidence of a killer Sasquatch, while others think this could be a serial killer running amok. Is this a deranged human screaming in the wild?
Canada is a vast, wild wilderness. Could a serial killer be loose in the woods of Canada? It's possible.
The Harrison River Valley, located to the southwest of British Columbia, is home to the indigenous nation known as the Chehalis. They consider the Sasquatch a sacred caretaker of the land. They even use him as a totem of their nation. Let's see what our experts think about this Canadian creature. Biologist Floyd Hayes fills us in on what we would normally find or hear lurking in these woods.
There are many species of animals that communicate by vocalizing. In general, the sounds are somewhat correlated with the body size of the animal, with larger animals producing louder sounds. The British Columbia wolf is a subspecies of the gray wolf, and it lives in this area and it grows rather large. It makes very loud howling sounds.
That leads us to forensic audio analyst Dr. Rob Maher, who first compares this audio to that of a large wolf.
So we can compare the sound of a wolf So this is a spectrogram of the wolf howl. If we look at the Whitset howl sound, we see more high-frequency information, and the contour is different than the wolf.
So no exact match for the local fauna. But what about a Bigfoot? Maher brings up the famous Sierra sounds for comparison.
The Bigfoot recording has more energy in the lower frequency range, and it's more of a whoop rather than a shriek sound. They seem to be two distinctive types of sounds.
So no Bigfoot. But what about the idea that the sounds are connected to some disturbed serial killer haunting the Canadian woods? Maher says no.
Trying to make the sounds that are up in the higher range up here in several thousand hertz, I'm a little skeptical that a human could make that sound.
So what could be making this horrific noise? Turns out, maybe nothing. Or nothing real, at least.
In the spectrogram, we can see these vertical dark areas where the sound disappears during the recording. One of the reasons you might have these dropouts would be that the audio had been edited or changed. It raises a lot of questions about the integrity of that recording and whether it's really authentic.
Our verdict? With no exact audio matches and some questionable evidence about the recording, we're going with potential hoax. And while we didn't find a Bigfoot this time, British Columbia's forests cover an area of 149 million acres, the size of France and Germany combined. So there's plenty left to explore. Coastal erosion has been a concern for parts of Florida for decades, especially when big storms strike. But one Florida town has recently discovered that with the disappearance of sand comes the reappearance of strange objects from the past. It's December 2022 in Volusia County, Florida. As the area recovers from the recent onslaught of hurricanes Ian and Nicole, beachgoers near Daytona Beach stumble upon an anomaly on the foreshore. Photos taken from the air by the county show two parallel rows of jagged wooden posts sticking out of the sand. A couple of the boards lie lengthwise, connecting the posts, while others are strewn nearby. It appears to be a long buried structure. Archaeologist Chuck Mead, director of the Lighthouse Archaeological Maritime Program, heads to the scene to try to uncover more of the mysterious object.
We kind of assess the scene, and it becomes almost like a crime scene investigation. We're trying to understand what's going on.
Chuck and his team start digging and discover what looks like wooden timbers.
We could really begin to see kind of patterns in how these timbers were laid out. We could definitely tell that we had frames of a vessel.
So it seems Chuck is on the scene of a shipwreck. But what ship is this? And where is it from? Journalist Eric Grunhauser says there are several ideas.
One theory is that it is the result of the Bermuda Triangle, a fabled triangle of destruction and mystery that has claimed countless ships over the years.
Could this ship have been a victim of some unexplained force in the triangle? Or is it just an old ship beached during a long-ago storm?
A number of fleets have been sunk off the coast of Florida. Vessels carrying huge amounts of wealth and treasure. The so-called shipwreck trail that exists in the waters off the coast of the Florida Keys contains the remains of ships like the San Pedro that sunk in 1733. It contained a huge amount of wealth.
But maybe this wrecked ship was hauling booty that was looted.
Famous pirates like Blackbeard and Calico Jack were known to have visited the Florida coastline, and a number of pirate ships also were sunk off the coast of Florida. Some were sunk by natural causes, others were purposely sunk so that they wouldn't be taken. Could the remains that we're seeing here be the remains of one of those pirate ships?
Beyond speculation about piracy and the Bermuda Triangle, rough waters off Florida's coast can be dangerous to wooden boats of any kind. Though wood naturally floats, leaks between hull planks can lead to the loss of buoyancy and even the sinking of ships in storms. So what was it that brought this vessel down? Let's let our experts take the helm. Meteorologist Juan Hernandez says the amount of sand that's been displaced suggests this ship is very old.
Looks like we've lost 10, 15 feet of sand fairly quickly. Given the potent storm systems that plague the Bermuda Triangle, it's possible that a storm system led to this shipwreck and then buried it for centuries. It wouldn't be until another storm came through that it would be uncovered.
So even if the ship came from the area of the Bermuda Triangle, it likely just ran aground long ago in a bad storm. So could this actually be a real-life pirate ship? Archaeologist Kathy Strain says it's possible.
Piracy is really well known off the coast of Florida. In its heyday in the 1700s, there was up to 5,000 different pirates operating in those waters. So it's very possible that we don't know anything about this boat because it was stolen.
Chuck agrees the fact that there don't seem to be any ships reported missing or stolen in this area calls into question the piracy theory. And here's the thing, his further research reveals this wrecked ship likely sailed after 1800. The age of piracy had largely ended by then.
The size of the timbers, how they were shaped, how they were joined together, what types of fasteners were used, all of these things really point to this dating to the 1800s. By the 1800s, there's a lot of shipping. So it's most likely to be a cargo ship, a merchant vessel.
Chuck says the continuous tides on the beach have made it impossible to uncover much more than the top of the boat. And so far, no sign of treasure. Our verdict, this is likely a 19th century merchant ship. Piracy had mostly died down in the Atlantic by the 1800s, so it's unlikely this ship was purloined by the likes of Blackbeard before it went down. Still, the lack of any records documenting the loss of a ship in that area at that time means this vessel remains part of the broader Bermuda Triangle mystery, at least for now. Prehistoric Native Americans left records of their ancestral traditions in their rock art. One symbol found among their stone carvings is said to be connected to a powerful and mystical ancient being. Could this rock provide a bridge to another world? It's January 2021, deep in the mountains of Jackson County, North Carolina. YouTubers Shane Simmons and Melody West have traveled to a mysterious site famed throughout the state.
Let's get out, take a look.
Let's do it.
You ready for this?
I'm ready.
At the bottom of a small hill, a large gray soapstone boulder emerges, nestled in the grass.
A lot of interesting carvings on here.
But up close, it's clear the curves and cuts combine to tell an ancient story.
And when you get down there, the first thing you want to look for is the 7 fingers of Judicala.
The legend claims the 7 fingers are the actual handprint of an ancient 7-fingered giant. Author Alexis Brooks says the Cherokee people consider Judakula to be a psychopomp, a being that guided souls between the material world and the spiritual one.
The Judakula giant is said to be one who comes from the mountaintop, has landed on this rock, but he did so with a purpose. He was there to chase off intruders.
But perhaps Judakula isn't simply a mystical giant coming down from the mountains, but rather an ancient astronaut visitor coming from outer space. Author Jason Martell says the story goes that when Judakula crashed into the rock, he may have opened a portal to other worlds, perhaps to where he originated.
We know that there's been a lot of UFO activity in the area. It's very possible that this is some type of a beacon or a lighthouse, perhaps opening some type of lost energy field. There's even been suggested that Judakula the giant himself used this as a gateway that would allow for communication even today.
Shane says this force of energy is something he felt firsthand.
Touching the rock itself, it gave a little bit of a charge, for lack of a better word. You just feel something from the rock.
Stories of powerful giants can be found in numerous ancient texts. From the Greek gigantes to the Hebrew Nephilim, some believe these giants really walked the earth. So could Judakula be a similar supersized being? Let's see how our experts measure up. Archaeologist Dr. Ed Barnhart considers if this mark was truly left by Judakula the giant.
Many people believe that print there was his actual handprint, but in actuality, we can see that it is carved into the stone.
Barnhart says the well-defined edges and grooves that seem to curl up toward the rock face prove that it's been chiseled out, since a handprint impression like this one made in clay would be less delineated and more diffused.
This stone was probably carved hundreds and hundreds of years ago.
What's more, Barnhart doesn't believe the stone is telling us just one story, but instead, many.
At 1,500 different carvings, that's the most on any stone in all of North America. The initial carvings on this stone could be reaching back thousands of years ago. In my experience, rocks that have this much carving on them are not done in a single episode. They're done repeatedly over generations.
And NASA geologist Dr. Bob Anderson adds that the type of rock has made it particularly convenient for petroglyphs.
The rock is made up of soapstone, which is a metamorphic rock, a rock that has been changed. It's been heated by pressure and or temperature. It actually makes it very soft and it's easy to carve into.
Barnhart says, given the location of the rock, it was likely carved during the Mississippian period, which lasted from about 800 AD to around 1600 AD, and saw the development of some of the most complex societies that had ever existed in North America.
Big, unique pieces of geology, topography like this were oftentimes landmarks along protected trade routes. Of course, the Mississippian civilization were a bunch of independent city-states, and you didn't want to accidentally, without permission, cross from one territory to another because you would be in big trouble.
So maybe there's some truth to the legend of Judakula, at least the part about the rock being used to scare away intruders and mark the tribe's turf.
This was a marker that showed the extent of what their tribe was so that people would understand that they would be protecting this land. Before smartphones, before the internet, before computers, this is the way that the people were actually talking tribe to tribe. It's just like using Google Maps that you have on your cars nowadays.
Our verdict: these complex markings were engraved by indigenous peoples as a sophisticated map. While the story of Judakula is compelling, we have no evidence the markings on this boulder belong on his list of accomplishments, though we still have no idea why visitors say the rock seems to have an otherworldly energy. We all know they do things differently in California. The Golden State has its own laws on everything from fuel efficiency to marijuana. But does it have its own laws of gravity? Follow us into the Redwood Forest to find out. It's January 2023 in the beach town of Santa Cruz, California. known for its great surfing and long wharf. But local YouTuber Ryan Sonneville is interested in documenting a more unusual area attraction. A strange cabin in the redwood forest where gravity itself seems to have joined the counterculture.
If you live around Santa Cruz or anywhere in Northern California, you probably see people with the very iconic mystery spot bumper stickers driving around.
The mystery spot is a small structure where everything seems just a little off-kilter, and where a tour guide is effortlessly able to walk up a wall. Ryan says it feels very disorienting.
It's pretty immediate the minute you go into it that it doesn't feel right, like you're able to stand on a bench and be leaning forward in a way that you would generally feel like I'm going to fall forward.
The mystery spot opened to the public in 1940 and has perplexed hundreds of thousands of visitors from all over the world. Journalist Eric Grunhauser says that this anomaly has resulted in decades of speculation about why it is the way it is.
So there are a number of theories about why the laws of gravity and physics seem to no longer apply around the vicinity of the Santa Cruz mystery spot. One theory goes that aliens came to our planet and one of their spacecraft crashed there in the forest, and that the remains are somehow causing gravitational distortions.
Or maybe the layer of rock between the Earth's crust and its core is to blame.
Another theory goes the mystery spot actually sits on some kind of magma chamber that is producing a lower density of mass so that the gravity above it in the mystery spot doesn't have the same qualities that it does elsewhere on the planet.
With thousands of visitors each year, the mystery spot calls to mind P.T. Barnum's Popular American Museum. In order to keep the crowds moving, Barnum put up signs saying, "This way to the egress." Not knowing egress meant exit, many people followed the sign in search of a new attraction, not realizing they were literally being shown the door. So what do our experts think of this crowd-pleasing site in Santa Cruz? Physicist Dr. Matthew Shadaga says that electromagnetic effects from an alien spacecraft probably wouldn't be strong enough to distort gravity like this.
Gravity, when it's distorted, needs to be distorted due to extremely strong fields. So things like a black hole singularity.
In a black hole, the pull of gravity is so strong that even light can't escape.
I can assure you that if something like that was in California, it would have destroyed the state, if not the entire planet by now.
But what about the effects of a magma chamber? Science writer Mick West investigates.
The idea is that the movement, the different density of the magma causes gravity to be different. The issue is the mystery spot lies on the San Andreas Fault, which is between two continental plates. That wouldn't allow buildup of magma. It would escape between the plates. That would only actually work in the middle of a continental plate.
So West has a more even-planed explanation.
This is essentially an artificial gravity hill. We don't see any true verticals anywhere in this spot. The trees themselves are more or less vertical, but sometimes trees lean over. The fences are all at strange angles. The floor is always at an angle. There's no flat ground anywhere. And so your brain never knows which way is up.
But Shadagas has the data to prove this is just a fun illusion.
I've actually been to the mystery spot myself, and I was able to measure the tilt effect with the digital leveler app. It has an approximate average tilt of 17 degrees. A 17-degree grade, especially when you disguise it by clever construction, can be very hard for the human eye to perceive. While it may not be aliens or gravitational anomalies, I highly recommend the Santa Cruz Mystery Spot as a wonderful place to go.
The first howl arrived not as sound but as absence, a sudden hollowing of the desert air around Holloman Air Force Base. The kind of silence that presses inward on the ears until the mind invents a noise to fill it. And when the recording finally played back hours later inside a climate-controlled briefing room, it revealed a long elastic well that bent upward at the end like something alive testing the limits of its lungs, something neither mechanical nor easily animal. And it was in that moment that I understood why the proof is out there had sent us here. Because the desert around Holloman has always been a place where proof hides in plain sight, shimmering just beyond the edge of belief. and the locals had been reporting these howls for months, claiming they echoed off the gypsum dunes at night, sometimes accompanied by lights skimming low across restricted airspace, sometimes followed by nothing at all except the sense of being watched. And as a novelist masquerading as an investigator, I was supposed to translate data into story without surrendering to myth. Yet the myth was already waiting for us, coiled in the heat like a patient predator. Holloman itself looked ordinary enough at first glance, a lattice of runways and hangars stitched into the desert like a scar that never quite healed. But the ground remembered everything. Missile tests, classified flights, experimental programs that never made it into official histories. And when people speak of beastly howls, they are often really speaking of buried memories clawing their way back to the surface, though no one on our team said that aloud. Instead, we cataloged witness statements with professional detachment, ranchers describing a cry to deep for coyotes and to sustained for wolves. Security personnel recounting nights when perimeter alarms tripped without visual confirmation. A sound technician from Alamogordo insisting the frequency range dipped below known mammalian norms. And all of it fed into the central question the show thrives on: whether proof exists independently of belief, or whether belief is the lens that sharpens proof into focus. On our first night in the field, the temperature dropped faster than expected and the stars came out sharp as broken glass. The desert performing its usual trick of making humans feel simultaneously insignificant and targeted. And as we set up directional microphones along the dry arroyo, the base loomed behind us, floodlights humming like captive suns, a reminder that whatever else looked out here did so under the watchful eye of the military, or perhaps because of it. I remember thinking about how many stories begin with a sound in the dark, how ancient that trope is, and how modern technology has not dulled it so much as given it new tools. Because now the sound can be slowed down, visualized, dissected into waveforms that resemble mountain ranges or heartbeats, and yet the emotional response remains the same, a tightening in the chest, a primitive readiness to run or fight. And when the howl finally came that night, it rolled across the desert in a way that made the sand itself seem to vibrate. Long enough for us to exchange glances and short enough to vanish before our rational minds could pin it down. Later, back in the mobile lab, the playback revealed harmonics that overlapped strangely, as if two sources were vocalizing in imperfect unison. And that was when one of the producers mentioned Holloman's history with animal testing programs in the mid-20th century. Chimpanzees and other species trained for spaceflight and exposure experiments, a fact everyone knew but rarely connected to contemporary mysteries, and I felt the narrative gears begin to turn. Not because I believed some forgotten creature had survived in the desert for decades, but because belief itself was the engine of every report we had collected. The proof is out there thrives on that tension, on the gap between explanation and experience. And Holloman offered a perfect stage because it sits at the intersection of secrecy and exposure. A place where classified projects brush up against public land and rumors leak out like groundwater, nourishing strange growths of speculation. During interviews the next day, we spoke with a retired radar technician who described anomalous returns coinciding with the nights of the howls, blips that appeared briefly at low altitude before dissolving into static. And while he insisted he had no reason to embellish his story, his eyes betrayed a lingering excitement, the kind that comes from holding a secret just long enough for it to ferment into identity. And I noted how often these accounts were framed not as fear but as privilege. As if witnessing the unexplained granted the observer a special status, a sense of having brushed against something larger than themselves. That psychological component interested me as much as the sound itself, because if proof is out there, it is filtered through human perception, through memory and desire and the quiet hope that the world is stranger than it appears on the surface. And Holloman, with its endless horizons, invites that hope even as it intimidates. In the afternoon heat, we visited a stretch of desert outside the base where several witnesses claimed the howls originated, a shallow basin ringed by scrub and rock. And standing there in daylight, it seemed impossible that anything could hide for long, yet the desert has a way of swallowing evidence, of erasing tracks within hours. And as I walked the perimeter, I thought about how the show's title is both assertion and challenge, because proof is not simply discovered, it is argued into existence. negotiated among experts and audiences, and sometimes abandoned when it refuses to behave. Our sound engineer ran tests, clapping, shouting, playing recorded animal calls through a speaker to study how the basin shaped echoes. And while none replicated the original howl exactly, they demonstrated how easily sound can be distorted, stretched, made monstrous by terrain. A fact that comforted the skeptics on our team while leaving the believers unsatisfied. And that unresolved tension followed us back to camp as the sun set again and the desert prepared for another performance. That night the howl returned twice, the second time closer, sharper, and for a brief irrational moment I felt certain it was responding to us, aware of the microphones and cameras. And even as my rational mind dismissed the thought, my heart rate betrayed me, because stories have power precisely because they bypass reason, and in that bypass lies both danger and discovery. By the time dawn bled into the desert sky on our third day near Holloman Air Force Base, the howls had already transformed from an anomaly into a presence. Something the crew spoke about in lowered voices as if volume alone might invite it closer. And this subtle shift in behavior fascinated me more than any waveform or spectral analysis because it demonstrated how quickly humans adapt to mystery. How uncertainty stops being a question and becomes an atmosphere, something breathed in unconsciously, shaping decisions and emotions without ever fully announcing itself. The proof is out there thrives on moments like this, when investigation quietly slips into anticipation. And I found myself thinking less like a documentarian and more like a novelist attuned to pacing, to the way suspense accumulates not through revelation, but through delay. Through the careful withholding of answers that allows imagination to do the heavy lifting. That morning we met with a biologist who had been consulted unofficially by base personnel, a woman with sun-cracked skin and a voice roughened by years of fieldwork. And she dismissed the idea of an unknown large predator outright while conceding that the acoustic signature we played her did not align neatly with known species in the region, pointing instead toward the possibility of layered sounds, environmental resonance, or even stress-induced vocalizations from animals reacting to something else entirely. An explanation that felt scientifically sound and narratively unsatisfying, which is often the case when reality refuses to cooperate with story structure. Still, she accompanied us to a rocky outcrop overlooking the basin where the howls had been recorded most clearly, explaining how temperature inversions at night could trap sound close to the ground, allowing it to travel farther and appear to originate from impossible distances. And as she spoke, I watched the crew's faces, noting how some leaned into her words as if grateful for an exit ramp from the unknown while others resisted, their expressions betraying a reluctance to let go of the mystery so easily. The show's premise depends on that friction, on the push and pull between skepticism and wonder, and Holloman provided a particularly volatile mix because of its history. Because every rational explanation seemed to bounce off decades of secrecy and speculation, accumulating suspicion rather than dispelling it. Later that day we were granted limited access to archival material, sanitized and carefully curated, but enough to remind us that Holloman has long been a testing ground for cutting-edge technology, from early drone prototypes to experimental propulsion systems. And while none of the documents referenced anything that could plausibly produce beastly howls, the sheer volume of redactions acted as narrative negative space, inviting viewers to imagine what might have been removed. And as a writer, I recognized this as a classic technique. The power of absence to generate meaning far beyond what presence alone can achieve. In interviews with base representatives, the language was precise to the point of sterility, emphasizing routine operations and denying any unusual activity during the nights in question. Yet the denial itself felt rehearsed, not deceptive necessarily, but protective, as if acknowledging mystery might open a door they preferred to keep sealed. And I wondered how much of the phenomenon existed because of that seal, because humans are exquisitely sensitive to boundaries, to places we are told not to look, and we respond by looking harder, listening more intently, projecting narratives into the gaps. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the desert in copper and violet, we returned to the basin with a new array of equipment. including thermal cameras and vibration sensors designed to detect movement beneath the surface. And while part of me expected nothing to happen, another part leaned forward eagerly, primed by days of tension and storytelling to receive whatever the night offered. When the howl came, it was different this time, shorter, fractured, almost conversational. And the thermal feed lit up briefly with a bloom of heat that vanished before anyone could triangulate its source, leaving us with more questions than answers and a palpable sense of frustration that edged into excitement, because ambiguity is addictive. And each unanswered question sharpened the desire for resolution. Back in the lab, the analysis revealed inconsistencies that defied easy categorization. Frequencies overlapping in ways that suggested either a complex biological source or a confluence of simpler ones interacting with the environment. And as the debate unfolded among the team, I found myself less interested in which side would prevail than in how the argument itself mirrored the larger cultural conversation about the unknown, about whether we demand closure or can tolerate uncertainty without rushing to fill it with monsters or conspiracies. The proof is out there does not promise definitive answers, and Holloman underscored that ethos by offering evidence that was suggestive rather than conclusive. A breadcrumb trail that led not to revelation, but to reflection. And as we packed up for the night, I sensed that the story was no longer just about a sound in the desert, but about the human impulse to listen for meaning in the dark. To believe that something is calling out to us even when we cannot quite understand the language. If the first days at Holloman taught us how mystery announces itself and the following nights taught us how it settles in, then the third phase of our investigation revealed something more unsettling. The way unanswered questions begin to reshape perception itself, altering not just what we hear or see, but how we interpret every subsequent detail. And by the time we entered what the production schedule blandly labeled as Phase 3, the desert no longer felt like a neutral backdrop, but like an active participant. A silent collaborator that responded differently depending on who was listening and what they expected to find. The proof is out there has always occupied this liminal space between investigation and introspection, and nowhere did that feel more apparent than in the subtle changes in crew dynamics. The way jokes faded after sunset, the way even the most hardened technicians paused before replaying the audio files, as if some instinct warned them that repetition itself carried risk. That listening too closely might invite something unseen to step closer. On the fourth night, the howls did not come at all, and that absence proved more disruptive than their presence had been, creating a vacuum into which speculation rushed unchecked. Theories multiplying like desert insects after rain, some pointing toward undisclosed military technology, others toward psychological priming. The human tendency to perceive patterns where none exist, and still others toward something older and less defined, an echo of prehistoric fear that modern language struggles to contain. We interviewed a cultural historian from New Mexico who spoke about indigenous legends tied to the land surrounding Holloman, stories of boundary creatures that existed between worlds. Not monsters in the Hollywood sense, but manifestations of imbalance, signs that something hidden had been disturbed. And while we were careful not to frame these accounts as explanations, their resonance was undeniable because they echoed the same emotional undercurrent running through contemporary reports, the sense that the howls were not random but reactive, a response to intrusion rather than a broadcast into the void. That idea lingered with me as we examined in data streams, including seismic readings that showed faint irregular vibrations coinciding with some of the recorded nights. Too weak to indicate significant underground movement, but consistent enough to raise eyebrows, and once again the evidence hovered frustratingly between categories, neither damning nor dismissible, occupying that uncomfortable middle ground where proof refuses to resolve into certainty. During a late-night discussion, one of the producers suggested that the phenomenon might be less about a singular source and more about convergence, a perfect storm of environmental conditions, technological noise, human expectation, and historical context. And while this explanation lacked the visceral appeal of a hidden beast or secret experiment, it felt truer to the complexity of what we were observing, reminding me that reality often resists clean narratives, preferring messy intersections to tidy conclusions. Still, as a novelist embedded in this process, I could not ignore how strongly the beast narrative persisted, resurfacing in off-camera conversations. In the way crew members described the sound using organic metaphors, throats and lungs and breath, even when discussing mechanical possibilities. And that linguistic slippage revealed how deeply ingrained certain archetypes remain, how quickly the mind reaches for familiar shapes when confronted with ambiguity. On the sixth night, the Howls returned unexpectedly, erupting closer to the base perimeter than before, triggering security alerts and forcing us to coordinate with military personnel who were visibly uneasy despite their training. And in that moment, the boundaries between civilian curiosity and institutional control blurred, underscoring one of the show's recurring themes. That proof becomes more elusive the closer it drifts toward power, secrecy acting as both shield and catalyst for speculation. Thermal cameras captured fleeting distortions that could not be definitively labeled, heat signatures that bloomed and collapsed too quickly to track. And the audio once again displayed overlapping frequencies that suggested multiplicity rather than singularity, reinforcing the idea that whatever we were hearing might be the product of interaction rather than origin. As the night wore on, fatigue set in, lowering cognitive defenses and amplifying emotional responses, and I realized how much of the experience depended on endurance, on how long one could sit with uncertainty before demanding resolution, and whether the desire for closure might itself distort interpretation more than any environmental variable. When dawn finally arrived, it brought no answers, only a sense of having crossed an invisible threshold, of having moved beyond initial curiosity into a deeper, more personal engagement with the unknown. And I suspected that from this point forward the investigation would say as much about us as it did about the Howls, about the stories we are willing to tell ourselves when proof remains tantalizingly out of reach. By the time we moved into what I privately began to think of as the fourth movement of our stay at Holloman Air Force Base, the investigation had acquired a strange internal gravity, pulling every new observation into orbit around the Howls whether it belonged there or not, and that this distortion of focus was not accidental but inevitable. Because once a mystery establishes itself as the dominant narrative, it begins to rewrite context retroactively, turning coincidence into clue and silence into implication. A process the proof is out there has always documented as carefully as any piece of physical evidence. The crew no longer asked whether the Howls would return, but when and in what form, and that expectation altered the rhythm of our days, making daylight feel like mere preparation for the real work that unfolded after sunset, when the desert cooled and the air itself seemed more receptive, more willing to carry secrets. During interviews with additional base personnel, we encountered a curious pattern, not of shared experience, but of shared restraint, answers delivered with careful neutrality, pauses lingering just a fraction longer than necessary, and while none contradicted official statements outright, the cumulative effect suggested an awareness of boundaries, of lines not to be crossed even in casual conversation, and that awareness fed the narrative tension far more effectively than any explicit denial ever could. As a writer, I recognize this instinctively, understanding that what is left unsaid often carries greater weight than what is articulated, especially in environments shaped by hierarchy and classification, and Holloman was steeped in both. That afternoon, we analyzed new audio data using enhanced filtering techniques, stripping away background noise layer by layer until the core signal emerged with unsettling clarity, revealing tonal modulations that mimicked organic vocalization closely enough to unsettle even the most skeptical among us. And yet the analysis also exposed irregularities inconsistent with known biological processes, a duality that once again left us suspended between explanation and enigma. The sound seemed to breathe, to swell and recede, and listening to it repeatedly induced a subtle emotional response I could not fully explain, a tightening behind the eyes, a heightened alertness, as if the body recognized something the intellect could not categorize. And in that gap between sensation and comprehension, the idea of a beast took root not as belief but as metaphor, a shorthand for the unknown force exerting pressure on our collective imagination. We spoke with a psychologist specializing in auditory perception who explained how low-frequency sounds can trigger unease and even fear by resonating with the body's own rhythms, a phenomenon documented in everything from natural disasters to industrial environments, and her explanation was convincing. Yet even as she spoke, I noticed how the crew leaned closer to the speakers during playback, drawn in despite their understanding, illustrating the paradox at the heart of the investigation. That knowing how something works does not necessarily diminish its impact. As night fell, we expanded our monitoring perimeter, placing sensors closer to restricted zones under supervision, and this proximity to the base heightened the stakes, introducing logistical constraints that mirrored the conceptual ones we had been grappling with since arrival, the constant negotiation between access and limitation. When the hull came that night, it was accompanied by a secondary sound, a rhythmic pulse that registered faintly on vibration sensors, but barely registered audibly. And the synchronization of these signals suggested coordination, whether natural or artificial, intentional or emergent. And for a brief electrifying moment, the entire operation seemed poised on the brink of breakthrough, only for the signals to fade abruptly, leaving us staring at screens filled with afterimages and incomplete data. The disappointment that followed was palpable, not because we had failed, but because we had come so close to something that felt meaningful without being able to grasp it. And I realized then that the investigation had become less about proving the existence of a beast or debunking it and more about tracing the contours of uncertainty itself, mapping the emotional and cognitive terrain it creates. As we packed up equipment in the pre-dawn chill, I caught myself listening intently to the wind, to the distant hum of the bass, to every scrape and rustle, aware that my perception had been permanently altered by the experience, and that whatever the ultimate explanation might be, the Howls had already succeeded in one undeniable way. They had changed us, reshaping how we listened to the world around us. What became clear as we moved deeper into the fifth stage of the investigation was that the Howls had begun to function less like an isolated phenomenon and more like a narrative gravity well, bending every surrounding detail toward themselves. And this shift was subtle enough that none of us remarked on it directly, yet profound enough to change the texture of our thinking. Because once a mystery becomes central, it starts to rewrite not only evidence, but intention, making every action feel consequential even when it is routine. The proof is out there has always documented this transformation with quiet precision, the moment when investigators stop merely collecting data and begin unconsciously performing for the unknown, adjusting behavior in response to an imagined observer, and Holloman proved no exception, especially as our presence near restricted airspace intensified scrutiny from base security, whose increased patrols and procedural briefings added a layer of institutional tension that mirrored the psychological pressure building within the crew. During a midday review session, we overlaid audio recordings from multiple nights, aligning timestamps with meteorological data, flight logs, and seismic activity. And while the composite revealed correlations that were intriguing, none crossed the threshold into definitive causation, leaving us once again in that liminal space where interpretation becomes both opportunity and liability. One producer suggested that the phenomenon might be episodic by design, whether through mechanical testing schedules or environmental cycles we did not yet understand. And while this theory offered structure, it also raised uncomfortable questions about intentionality, about whether the Howls were accidental byproducts or deliberate signals. And if deliberate, then for whom? That question lingered as we conducted interviews with residents who lived closest to the base perimeter. People whose daily lives were shaped by the low-level roar of jets and the distant thunder of testing, and several described the Howls not with fear but with familiarity, as if they had been folded into the ambient soundscape of the region, another reminder that perception is relative, that what unsettles an outsider may barely register to those accustomed to living on the edge of controlled chaos. One rancher in particular spoke of nights when livestock grew restless moments before the Howls began, a detail that resonated with folkloric patterns as much as with scientific ones. And while we documented his account carefully, we were equally careful not to frame it as proof, aware of how easily anecdote can harden into belief when repeated often enough. As dusk approached, we prepared for what felt like a decisive night, deploying our most comprehensive array of sensors yet, including experimental acoustic triangulation software capable of estimating source movement in real time. And the anticipation was palpable. A shared sense that whatever happened next would push the investigation toward either resolution or retreat. When the howls came, they arrived in rapid succession, shorter and more frequent than before, and the software struggled to lock onto a stable origin, its projections jumping erratically across the map as if chasing something that refused to be fixed. And watching those shifting vectors, I was struck by how perfectly they mirrored our own experience. The constant pursuit of clarity that slipped away just as it seemed within reach. The sound itself carried a raw urgency absent from earlier recordings, and for the first time I felt a flicker of genuine unease that transcended intellectual curiosity. A bodily response that reminded me how thin the veneer of rationality can be when confronted with something that refuses categorization. Base personnel monitored the activity closely, but offered no additional context, their neutrality now feeling less reassuring and more opaque. And in that opacity, the imagination found room to roam, filling gaps with speculation that ranged from the mundane to the fantastical. After the final howl faded, the desert fell into an uncanny stillness, the kind that feels less like peace and more like expectation. And as we shut down equipment in the early hours, I realized that the investigation had reached an inflection point. Not because we were closer to an answer, but because the question itself had evolved, no longer simply asking what was making the sound, but why it mattered so deeply to those who heard it. Why it lingered long after the echoes died away, reshaping thought and memory in its wake. By the sixth phase of our time at Holloman Air Force Base, the investigation had crossed a threshold that was difficult to define yet impossible to ignore. A point at which the howls no longer felt like external events to be captured and analyzed, but internalized phenomena shaping perception, memory, and expectation. And this internalization was perhaps the most revealing data of all, because it exposed how deeply the unknown can infiltrate even the most disciplined minds. The proof is out there has always operated on the understanding that evidence is never purely objective, that it is filtered through the observer's psychology. And Holloman provided a near textbook case as fatigue, repetition, and anticipation combined to erode the sharp boundaries we had initially maintained between curiosity and belief. Morning briefings grew quieter, more focused, as if everyone sensed that speaking too freely might dilute whatever fragile coherence the investigation still possessed. And even casual observations were weighed carefully, stripped of speculation before being voiced aloud. We brought in an aerospace engineer with experience in experimental propulsion acoustics, a man whose career had been built on explaining strange noises that once fueled rumors of impossible aircraft, and his analysis of the howls was methodical and restrained, pointing to resonance effects, Doppler distortion, and the possibility of overlapping test activities interacting unpredictably with the desert environment. Explanations that carried institutional credibility yet left emotional questions unanswered, because they addressed how such sounds could occur without addressing why they felt so profoundly unsettling. During a controlled test, we played synthesized tones through speakers positioned at varying elevations, attempting to recreate the recorded harmonics. And while we achieved partial success, the resulting sound lacked the organic elasticity of the original howls, reinforcing the sense that something about the phenomenon resisted artificial replication. That resistance fed speculation even among those committed to skepticism, not because they believed in a literal beast, but because they recognized the limits of their models. The uncomfortable truth that not all variables can be isolated or controlled, especially in an environment as vast and dynamic as the desert surrounding a major military installation. As night fell, the sky clouded unexpectedly, muting the stars and dampening sound, and the absence of the howls during those hours created a strange emotional whiplash. Relief intermingled with disappointment, underscoring how quickly anticipation had become a kind of dependency, a psychological loop in which the unknown provided structure to our experience. In the early morning hours, a single howl broke the silence, distant and attenuated, almost tentative, and its restraint felt intentional, as if whatever produced it were aware of our listening. A thought I dismissed even as it lingered, because the line between metaphor and belief had grown dangerously thin. Reviewing the data later revealed subtle anomalies coinciding with that final sound, fluctuations too small to headline an episode yet too consistent to ignore. And those marginal details began to feel emblematic of the entire case, proof that hovered at the edge of recognition without ever stepping fully into view. As we prepared to transition into the next stage of the investigation, I sensed a collective fatigue that was not merely physical but existential. The weariness that comes from staring into ambiguity for too long, and I wondered whether resolution would ultimately feel like relief or loss, because the Howls, for all their disturbance, had given shape to our days, a reminder that mystery still exists in a world saturated with surveillance and data. And that perhaps the most unsettling proof is not of beasts or secrets, but of how deeply we crave the unknown even as we struggle to explain it away. Entering the 7th phase of the investigation felt less like moving forward and more like descending, as if each unanswered question had carved a deeper hollow beneath our certainty. And by now the desert around Holloman Air Force Base no longer appeared merely expansive but layered, stratified with meanings imposed by history, rumor, data, and the quiet projections of our own minds, all of which the proof is out there implicitly invites its audience to navigate without a map. The howls had become intermittent, unpredictable, and this irregularity proved more destabilizing than any consistent pattern, because the human mind craves rhythm. And when rhythm is denied, it invents intention, reading purpose into absence as readily as into presence. During this period, we focused heavily on synthesis rather than collection, revisiting every interview, every recording, every sensor anomaly, searching for connective tissue that might have been overlooked in the immediacy of discovery. And this retrospective analysis revealed something subtle yet profound. That the most compelling moments were not those with the strongest signals, but those that coincided with heightened emotional states among observers, nights marked by fatigue, tension, or anticipation, suggesting that the phenomenon and our response to it were entangled in ways that resisted separation. We consulted a neuroscientist who specialized in expectation and perception, and she spoke about predictive processing, the brain's tendency to anticipate sensory input and adjust interpretation accordingly, explaining how ambiguous stimuli can feel increasingly vivid when the mind is primed to receive them. And while her explanation was grounded in empirical research, it did not diminish the power of the howls, instead reframing them as a collaborative act between environment and observer. A duet rather than a monologue. That reframing unsettled some members of the crew who preferred external causes to internal ones, perhaps because internal explanations feel accusatory, implying complicity where we would rather locate mystery elsewhere. And I noted how quickly conversations shifted back toward mechanical or biological theories whenever the psychological dimension grew too prominent. Yet Holloman itself resisted such compartmentalization, its very existence a fusion of human intention and natural environment, where advanced technology operates within an ancient landscape. And the howls seem to emerge precisely from that intersection, neither wholly artificial nor wholly organic. One evening we were granted access to a decommissioned section of the base, a liminal space filled with obsolete equipment and empty hangars. And standing there at dusk, I felt an unexpected resonance with the phenomenon we were studying. The sense that remnants of past endeavors can continue to exert influence long after their official purpose has ended. Echoes persisting not as literal sounds, but as cultural and psychological artifacts. That night the howls returned with renewed intensity, reverberating across the desert in a way that felt less like an intrusion and more like a reminder. And for a fleeting moment I imagined them as the voice of the place itself, an articulation of accumulated stress and secrecy vented into the open air. A metaphor rather than an explanation, yet one that captured the emotional truth of the experience more effectively than any chart or graph. Sensors recorded overlapping anomalies once again, but by now their significance had shifted, becoming markers of continuity rather than clues to resolution. And I realized the investigation had quietly abandoned the hope of definitive proof. settling instead into a deeper inquiry about why certain mysteries persist despite our best efforts to contain them. As dawn approached and the desert light softened the edges of everything it touched, I felt a sense of reluctant acceptance spread through the crew. An understanding that whatever answer awaited us would likely be partial, provisional, and contested, and that perhaps this incompleteness was not a failure but a feature. An honest reflection of how knowledge unfolds in spaces where certainty is neither guaranteed nor easily earned. By the 8th phase, the investigation had reached a peculiar equilibrium, a state in which the Howls no longer dominated every waking thought yet continued to exert a steady pressure on perception. Like a low-frequency hum beneath consciousness that never fully faded. And this balance proved both stabilizing and unsettling, because it suggested adaptation rather than resolution. The human capacity to normalize even the most anomalous circumstances when exposure is prolonged. The proof is out there often captures this moment implicitly, the point at which mystery ceases to shock and instead becomes a lens through which all subsequent experiences are filtered. And at Holloman, this lens sharpened our awareness of subtleties we might otherwise have ignored, shifts in wind direction, minor fluctuations in ambient noise. The emotional cadence of interviews conducted long after novelty had worn thin. We revisited witnesses we had spoken with earlier, curious to see whether their accounts had evolved now that time had passed and media attention loomed. And what we found was not escalation but consolidation, stories smoothing themselves into more coherent shapes, rough edges sanded down by repetition. A reminder that memory is not a static archive but a living narrative constantly rewritten to make sense of itself. This realization complicated our efforts to extract raw data from testimony, yet it also enriched the broader story, revealing how the phenomenon continued to live on in the minds of those who experienced it, independent of our presence or validation. Technical analysis during this phase focused on long-term patterns rather than isolated events. And when we overlaid months of historical environmental data with reported sightings and recordings, a loose correlation emerged between the Howls and specific atmospheric conditions, particularly rapid temperature drops combined with certain wind shear profiles. A finding that offered a plausible explanatory framework without fully accounting for the more idiosyncratic elements of the phenomenon. Some team members embraced this model eagerly, relieved to anchor the mystery in something quantifiable, while others remained cautious, noting that correlation does not equate to causation and that the most compelling anomalies still resisted tidy categorization. As night fell on what would become one of our final extended monitoring sessions, the desert felt almost companionable, familiar in its vastness. And this familiarity made the sudden return of the Howls all the more jarring, because they cut through our acclimatization with renewed force, reminding us that adaptation does not confer control. The sound that night was layered and complex, rising and falling in a pattern that suggested modulation rather than randomness. And while our instruments captured the event with unprecedented clarity, the data once again refused to collapse into a single explanation, instead presenting multiple overlapping possibilities that each accounted for part of the whole while leaving the rest unresolved. In the aftermath of that recording, I felt a curious blend of satisfaction and melancholy. Satisfaction at having captured something undeniably compelling and melancholy at the realization that even this clarity might not bring closure, because the phenomenon seemed designed, whether intentionally or not, to remain just beyond definitive grasp. Conversations among the crew grew more reflective, less focused on solving the mystery and more on articulating what it meant to engage with it. And in those moments, I sensed the investigation transitioning from an active pursuit into a period of reckoning, a gradual acceptance that the Howls had served their purpose not by revealing a hidden truth, but by exposing the contours of our own expectations, fears, and desires. As we entered the 9th phase of the Holloman investigation, it became evident that we were no longer chasing the phenomenon so much as accompanying it, moving alongside an unresolved presence that had woven itself into our routines and conversations. And this companionship with uncertainty marked a subtle but important shift, because it stripped away the illusion that every mystery exists to be solved rather than experienced. The proof is out there often lingers in this territory without naming it, allowing viewers to sense the transition intuitively, and at Holloman that transition manifested as a quiet deceleration. Fewer frantic deployments of equipment, more deliberate listening, more time spent sitting in the desert at dusk simply observing how the landscape breathed as the day released its heat. The howls during this period were sparse but pointed, arriving without warning and departing just as abruptly, and their unpredictability seemed almost instructive, reinforcing the idea that control was never part of the bargain, that whatever dialogue existed between us and the phenomenon operated on its own terms. We conducted a final series of expert consultations, not in search of new theories but to pressure test the ones we already had, inviting critique rather than confirmation. And this process revealed how each explanation carried its own blind spots, areas it illuminated at the expense of others, reminding us that explanatory models are tools rather than truths. One physicist spoke about emergent phenomena, systems in which simple components interact to produce complex behaviors that cannot be predicted from the parts alone. And this framework resonated deeply, offering a way to think about the howls as products of convergence rather than origin, outcomes of environment, technology, and perception colliding in unpredictable ways. Yet even this elegant model left room for unease, because emergence resists mastery, implying that some outcomes will always surprise us no matter how sophisticated our understanding becomes. On one of our final nights in the field, we experienced what felt like a culmination, a prolonged sequence of howls that unfolded over nearly an hour, varying in pitch and in intensity, echoing across the desert in a way that felt almost narrative, as if the sound itself were telling a story we could sense but not translate. And standing there amid humming equipment and wide open darkness, I felt an unexpected gratitude, a recognition that the experience had offered something rare in a world increasingly defined by certainty and speed. The chance to sit with ambiguity without immediately collapsing it into explanation. The data from that night was rich and multifaceted, yet as we reviewed it in the early hours, I sensed that its true significance lay not in what it proved but in what it preserved. A record of a moment when humans encountered something that refused to be neatly categorized, forcing us to confront the limits of our frameworks and the narratives we build around them. As preparations for departure began the next day, the mood was contemplative rather than triumphant, marked by a shared understanding that closure would be provisional at best, and that the story of Holloman would continue to evolve long after we left, carried forward by those who lived with the howls as part of their ongoing reality rather than a contained investigation. The 10th phase arrived with the quiet inevitability of an ending that refuses to announce itself. A gradual awareness settling over the team that whatever definitive revelation we might once have expected was no longer the point. And this realization reframed our remaining time at Holloman Air Force Base not as a final push for answers, but as a careful documentation of transition. The moment when investigation gives way to interpretation and experience hardens into memory. The proof is out there has always existed in this threshold space, and here it became especially clear that the most durable proof is often not physical but experiential, residing in how events alter perception long after the instruments are packed away. Our final days were spent assembling the narrative arc from fragments, aligning sound analysis with interviews, expert commentary with visual context. And as this synthesis took shape, I noticed how the howls themselves receded slightly in prominence, becoming less the protagonist of the story and more the catalyst that set everything else in motion. This shift felt honest, even necessary, because by now the phenomenon had revealed its limits, refusing to escalate into spectacle or resolve into banality, maintaining a stubborn equilibrium that mirrored the larger theme of the series. That mystery persists not because we lack intelligence or technology, but because some aspects of reality resist compression into singular explanations. During one last extended interview, a longtime base employee spoke candidly about living with constant unknowns, about how secrecy and speculation coexist as parallel truths, each shaping behavior in different ways, and his words crystallized something that had hovered at the edges of our experience. The idea that places like Holloman are not defined solely by what happens there but by what people believe might be happening, the shadow narrative that runs alongside the official one. That shadow narrative, I realized, is where the Howls truly lived, not as beasts or experiments, but as symbols of unresolved tension between transparency and control, between the human desire to know and the institutional need to withhold. On our final night in the desert, we set up minimal equipment, more out of ritual than expectation, and sat together watching the horizon darken, listening not just for the howls but for everything else. The wind threading through scrub, the distant rumble of aircraft, the soft percussion of insects. And in that expanded soundscape, the absence of the phenomenon felt almost appropriate, a reminder that mystery does not owe us consistency. When a single howl finally emerged near midnight, it was brief and distant, almost valedictory, and rather than triggering excitement, it elicited a collective stillness, an unspoken recognition that the encounter was concluding on its own terms. Reviewing that final recording later, I was struck not by its technical features, but by its context, by how it functioned as punctuation rather than climax. A subtle mark indicating pause rather than closure, and this subtlety felt truer to the experience than any dramatic crescendo could have been. As we prepared to leave Holloman, I carried with me a heightened awareness of how easily certainty dissolves when confronted with phenomena that refuse to conform, and how valuable that dissolution can be, forcing humility into disciplines that often prize confidence, reminding us that proof is not always a destination, but sometimes a process, one that continues long after the investigation formally ends. The 11th phase unfolded after departure, in that peculiar temporal afterspace where events continue to reverberate even when the physical setting has been left behind. And I came to understand that Holloman had not released us so much as followed us, trailing behind in altered listening habits, in the way sudden sounds now prompted a brief pause for interpretation, in the heightened sensitivity to ambiguity that had quietly rewired our perceptions. The proof is out there rarely addresses this aftermath directly, yet it is here that the investigation truly matures, because distance allows patterns to surface that proximity obscures. And in reviewing footage and transcripts away from the desert, I began to notice thematic consistencies that had been invisible in real time. Nearly every account, whether from witnesses, experts, or crew members, framed the howls not as threats but as interruptions, disruptions to an assumed order rather than invasions of safety. And this distinction mattered because it suggested that what unsettled people most was not danger but uncertainty, the challenge to narratives that keep the world predictable and manageable. In post-production discussions, the debate shifted from what caused the phenomenon to how it should be presented, a debate that mirrored the broader tension between skepticism and wonder, between the obligation to contextualize and the temptation to dramatize. And I watched as editors grappled with the ethical weight of representation, aware that framing can either invite curiosity or harden belief into dogma. Audio segments were scrutinized frame by frame, visualizations refined to avoid exaggeration, and expert commentary carefully balanced to reflect genuine disagreement rather than forced consensus. And through this meticulous process, I gained a deeper appreciation for how much of what audiences perceive as proof is shaped not by discovery but by curation. Meanwhile, reports continued to surface from Holloman and surrounding areas, sporadic accounts of distant howls that echoed familiar descriptions without escalating into crisis, reinforcing the sense that the phenomenon persisted independent of our attention, neither intensified by scrutiny nor diminished by explanation. This persistence complicated any attempt at narrative closure, because it resisted the tidy arc of mystery resolved, insisting instead on an open-ended structure that felt more faithful to lived experience. In private conversations, several crew members admitted to a lingering sense of incompletion, not dissatisfaction, but a subtle longing, as if the howls had offered a reminder of something easily forgotten in modern life, that not everything demands immediate resolution, that some questions are valuable precisely because they remain open. As a novelist, this resonated deeply, aligning with the understanding that the most enduring stories are those that continue to unfold in the reader's mind long after the final page. And I began to see Holloman less as a case study and more as a narrative seed, capable of generating countless interpretations depending on who encountered it and when. The more distance I gained, the clearer it became that the investigation had not failed to find proof, but had expanded the definition of what proof could be, shifting it from a singular object or explanation to a constellation of experiences, data points, and emotional responses that together formed a coherent yet incomplete picture. This reframing felt both unsettling and liberating, because it challenged the expectation that knowledge must always culminate in certainty, proposing instead that understanding can exist in degrees, provisional and revisable, shaped as much by humility as by confidence. The 12th phase emerged not as a conclusion, but as a quiet reckoning, the point at which all that had been gathered, experienced, debated, and deferred settled into something resembling understanding without ever crystallizing into certainty. And this distinction felt essential because Holloman had never offered itself as a place of answers, only as a site of encounter, where the unknown brushed against human systems designed to contain it. In reflecting on the investigation as a whole, I realized that the Howls had functioned less like evidence to be solved and more like a question posed repeatedly in different forms, each iteration stripping away assumptions until only the core remained, a simple yet unsettling inquiry into how we respond when the world refuses to explain itself. The proof is out there often leaves its audience suspended in this space deliberately, resisting the gravitational pull of closure. And in the case of Holloman, that resistance felt earned, because any definitive answer would have diminished the complexity of what had unfolded, flattening a multifaceted experience into a single explanatory note. Reviewing the final cut of the episode, I was struck by how restrained it felt compared to the emotional intensity of living through the investigation. A reminder that representation is always an approximation, that the most potent aspects of uncertainty rarely translate cleanly into narrative form, and that perhaps this gap is where imagination continues the work long after documentation ends. Messages from viewers began to arrive even before broadcast, some skeptical, others deeply invested, and reading them I recognized familiar patterns. The same oscillation between dismissal and fascination we had observed in ourselves, reinforcing the idea that the phenomenon extended beyond geography, resonating wherever people encountered the story and projected their own frameworks onto it. Several viewers wrote about sounds in their own environments that suddenly felt different, imbued with new significance after watching. And while these reactions could be dismissed as suggestibility, they also underscored the contagious nature of curiosity. The way one unresolved question can sensitize people to the unknown embedded in their daily lives. From this perspective, Holloman's Howls had already achieved a form of proof, not by establishing an external cause, but by demonstrating the persistence of wonder in a culture often assumed to be exhausted by explanation. A reminder that mystery does not vanish simply because we possess sophisticated tools for measurement. As time passed, the investigation receded into memory, yet it continued to surface unexpectedly in conversations sparked by unrelated anomalies, in moments of silence punctuated by unexplained sounds, and each resurfacing carried with it a trace of the desert, a sensory echo of wide open space and unanswered questions. In these moments, I understood that the true legacy of the experience lay not in what we concluded, but in what we carried forward. A recalibrated relationship with uncertainty that allowed for curiosity without surrendering to fear, skepticism without cynicism, and wonder without the demand for immediate resolution. And this balance felt like the most honest outcome Holloman could offer.